Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosen Rubiani podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. This week, we're discussing the recent D-Day celebrations that really made the headlines, uh, which this week's newsletter argues were much more than just a symbolic or rhetorical celebration. Brunello, let's start at the very beginning and with some of the history first and foremost. Tell me a bit more about D-Day and what exactly we're celebrating in this case.
So D-Day was the arrival of the Allied troops in Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944. And this is when the Allied troops effectively took by surprise the forces of the so-called Axis, so Germany, Austria, Italy, and so on, and um, effectively represented the beginning of the Allied troops taking back control of Europe. The idea was that starting from the north, so hence the arrival in the Normandy region in France, and then from the south, the liberation of Italy, and then from the east, the Russians going towards Berlin. So it was effectively concerted attack to reconquer Europe from the Nazi domination. And clearly, the Normandy episode represents, for these various reasons, one of the most symbolic periods of that episode.
And this has sort of clear symbolic consequences for the age we find ourselves now in, because perhaps had it not been for D-Day and that sort of last phase of the war, we'd live in a profoundly different world today. It comes, this sort of moment, at an interesting time in both the American, the British, and the European political cycles. Let's start with the American one because we've seen, the conviction of Donald Trump, the first ever criminal conviction of a former president of the United States. Why did that happen? What does the future look like for Donald Trump, as per the election is concerned? And what does it mean for the American democracy?
So that's the key point. The entire story of reconquering Europe started with the US engaging in World War II the same way they did in World War One. And this is because the US was and still is a liberal democracy. Therefore, it was a beacon of freedom for all the nations that in Europe were instead dominated by authoritarian regimes, such as the Nazis in Germany, the fascists in Italy, and so on. Um, and so the question we ask ourselves today is, what would have been the course of history if the US were, in fact, not a liberal democracy, but just, as we call it today, an electoral democracy, such as Turkey, for example, where the judiciary is not free, where press is not free, and so on? Would they come to Europe and rescue us? It's very hard to say, of course, but one could probably argue that that wouldn't be the case. So it's absolutely crucial that the US remains a liberal democracy. Now, considering what's going on in the US at the moment, we said many times that this is a risk, that the US may stop being a liberal democracy. And this is because if a man proves that he can be above the law, or whoever that man may be, um, then by definition, you wouldn't live in a liberal democracy. And this could be the case for Trump, who's just been convicted in his first of his four trials, considered responsible for 34 felonies. Um, and on the 11th of July, will be sentenced to either probation or paying a fine or even jail time. Now, for a number of reasons, the lawyers can explain way better than me. Jail time is not something that can be excluded a priori. But if Trump avoids that kind of sentence just because he's a former president, just because he's rich, just because he can effectively provoke the court and threaten witnesses and so on without paying any price, it would have proven that in fact there's a man above the law. And so if he gets reelected on November 5th, it would be kind of a proof, in our opinion, that the US is not a liberal democracy anymore.
And looking now to the other side of the Atlantic, to the United Kingdom and Europe, in the UK, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was blasted by the media for not attending the entirety of the D-Day sort of commemorations, heading back to the UK earlier on to do a press interview. And in Europe, this came at sort of roughly the same week as the European parliamentary elections, as people went to the polls and, as we saw, vote for a slightly more right-wing coalition. What's the significance of these two events, and what sort of do they bring for the future of British and European politics?
They're very important. It's kind of unheard of. A UK Prime Minister not attending the celebrations for the day, considering that so many British soldiers lost their lives during that battle. And there were many, many dozens of thousands. So just because there was a TV interview in the campaign, but Joe Biden is probably busy with equally important, if not more important, campaign, yet he attended and he made kind of important remarks. He made an analogy between Nazi Germany and Russia today and his invasion of Ukraine that is brutal and illegal. So that cannot be an excuse. Yet Prime Minister Sunak thought that was not important to come and celebrate this anniversary. And this is a big favor to Reform more than the Labour Party, so to the party that is making the more noise about British identity and the defense of the borders and so on and so forth. So I think a big mistake that Sunak will pay in the elections. In the EU, meanwhile, other elections have been held. The European elections that have marked a shift towards the right of the political spectrum. We'll see whether this will be translated as well in the composition of the Commission and the support that the Commission itself will find in the EU Parliament. But for sure, the political spectrum has moved towards the right. And this is kind of ironic because the party that's apparently have won those elections are somehow those deriving from the same parties that created the destruction of Europe 80 years ago. Some of them still have the symbols of that period in their current marks and signs. Meloni's Brothers of Italy still have the flame of Mussolini in their symbol. The Front National has been recently rebranded Rassemblement National just to sound a bit more reassuring, but it's still the party of Marine Le Pen, the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was a proud fascist of his own era. And, I could go on with other examples. So clearly, those 80 years celebration of the D-Day have nothing rhetorical these days, but clearly mark an important moment in our history to remind ourselves why so many people lost their lives. The fact that we can have European elections must have sounded like a dream to the founders of Europe, who actually fought to have less nation states, less nationalistic policies that caused the conflicts, and dream a more unified and peaceful Europe. So again, it seems like any other old-fashioned celebration, but it's nothing like that.
Yeah. And these sort of elections also happening with really important domestic political consequences, such as Macron calling for a snap election in France, kind of pretending possibly the rise of someone from the party of Marine Le Pen to the office of prime minister. And so, it shows how these elections can be important harbingers for both international and European, but also domestic political movements. Is certainly something that will have consequences well into the summer and for the rest of the year, as these sort of coalitions and the right wing, continues to gain momentum in parts of Europe. But as always, Bruno, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.